Good evening, everyone. My name is Abraham Murad. I'm a researcher here in Lahore, and I study the history of North India and Pakistan in its earlier decades, and especially its intersections with caste, colonial intervention, and transnational missionary networks. And in that sort of way, I'm really pleased to have with us a really well-known public intellectual, Dr. Priyamvada Gopal, who's based at the University of Cambridge.
Everyone.
Her research interests are in
I'm a researcher here in Lahore, and I study the history of North India and Pakistan in its earlier decades.
her research interests are in colonial and post-colonial literature, as I said, and gender and critical race studies. Her first book was called Literary Radicalism in India, and it looked at the development of post-colonial literature in relation to the work of the Progressive Writers Association and the Indian People's Theatre Association. Delving further into this sort of work, her second book, titled The Indian English Novel, traces the development of the English language or the Anglophone Indian novel as a literary form, looking at especially its emergence from the colonial encounter, as well as the Indian nation forming experience. And finally, her most recent, much acclaimed book, Insurgent Empire, is now out, in fact, in paperback, hopefully in a store near you. And recognition of her solid scholarship, she was recently also, Dr. Gopal was recently also announced as a chaired professor at the University of Cambridge. So first of all, congratulations for that.
Thank you.
And welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Thank you to you for hosting this, and to Yaqub and your other colleagues for inviting me. I wish I could be in Lahore. Wanted to visit Lahore all my life. But here we are. The pandemic means that's not possible, but I hope I can someday. Thank you for having me.
No, lovely. This pandemic, as sad and as closed as everything has become because of the pandemic, the events like these, the ThinkFest conversations, this is a new output that's come out of it, and I think this is a very welcome development in that capacity. But I certainly hope that we can have a physical book launch sometime very soon in Pakistan. So we've had, and I've been following the ThinkFest conversations for the last couple of weeks, and this is our 13th session, and we're always joined in by people from all over, from Lahore, Khanewal, Sialkot, Gujranwala, but interestingly enough, also from South India and Bangladesh, the UK, England, America, Australia. So it's quite interesting that the ThinkFest used to be a place where we used to pride ourselves that people from Faisalabad or Sialkot were coming in to Lahore to interact with scholars. But now, thanks to the pandemic, we've got a much global audience. In fact, I'd be interested if for the viewers who are watching, please let us know in the comment section where you're logging in from, so that we have a better idea while we interact with you. So to begin with, Priya, could you tell us what Insurgent Empire really means for you?
Okay, so Insurgent Empire is a book that really comes out of the years that I've spent in Britain. I've now been in Britain for about 19 years, and I've been kind of involved with debates around the British Empire and the legacies of the British Empire. And the book is, in a way, a kind of a counter history of the British Empire to the narrative that you get in Britain. Now, people in South Asia won't be quite so familiar with that narrative. The narrative in Britain is one where Britain ran a fairly benevolent empire in which it gave people, the gifts of the railways and of infrastructure, of English as a language, of modernity, of the parliamentary system. And then when it decided that the colonies were ready, it benevolently withdrew. So the narrative, or the kind of dominant public narrative, is very, very benevolent. And this is, of course, quite different from the nationalist narratives that we might have in different South Asian countries. I wanted to kind of come at this narrative critically, but I wanted to come at it from a productive rather than a simply critical angle. And one of the ways I decided to do that was to look at the question of resistance to empire outside Britain, from South Asia, from the Caribbean, from parts of Africa. But I also wanted to look at something that is hardly ever talked about in Britain, and that is criticism of the British Empire from within Britain itself, i.e., people we might call imperial dissidents, right? So just as we now in the countries that we might live in South Asia and India, Bangladesh, Pakistan, we know that there are people who are dissidents, who challenge kind of dominant rule, who challenge government. There were also people like that in Britain during the years of the British Empire. There were people who didn't think that what was being done in Britain's name, particularly the kind of huge violence that was enacted upon colonial peoples, that they wanted to be associated with that. And so they were people really who, and I look at the period from 1857 to about 1955, 56. In that 100-year period, there were many Britons who stood up and said, not in our name. In other words, who challenged what they saw as the less than benevolent aspects of the empire and challenged it. But there's one more dimension to their challenge. The book argues that this challenge was determinately shaped by resistance to the empire outside Britain. In other words, these are people in Britain who made, in some sense, intellectual, cultural, and or political alliances with resistors outside Britain, whether those were in British India, or whether they were in the West Indies, as we now know them, the Caribbean, the British Caribbean, or in parts of British West and East Africa. These are the kind of regions that I look at, and I really try to track the relationship between criticism of empire within Britain and resistance to empire outside Britain, and the alliances that were formed in that context.
This is excellent. How, to follow up on that, how, this assertion that not only people who are in South Asia or Africa speaking against empire, they're in fact white people in Britain who are saying not in my name, right?
Yeah.
But I was wondering how much of this is sort of different from, the narrative benevolence in itself. So, as one receives the ideas that, the sort of general outcome of empire really was, self-rule and all of those wonderful things which the Commonwealth has been able to accrue, through the years. How is, your claim in this book different from, is it not the same thing? What I mean by that is, did the empire not only develop in such a way that these dissident voices were in fact a part of the nature of empire and its sort of emancipatory possibilities?
See, I think that's a retrospective narrative. That's a narrative that historians of the British Empire have put out there in one sense in order to be able to claim dissidents as part of the British imperial project. That is not how it emerged. The British Empire had very little intention of freeing the colonies. That's very much a retrospective narrative, just as, in a sense, the abolition of slavery is also a retrospective narrative. And my argument is, in a way, and I'm glad you asked that question, is actually directly challenging the claim that empire conquered in order to free by saying there was no engagement with freedom until the colonized and the enslaved pushed back and demanded their freedom. And so therefore, it is very much a retrospective narrative that tries to defang or to domesticate the fact that there was ferocious resistance to empire from the very beginning.
Could you give us an example of a resistance?
Okay, I'm going to give an example that is perhaps less familiar to a South Asian audience, because I'm assuming that a good chunk of today's audience is South Asian. And this is the example of Jamaica in 1865. So we're talking about 8 years after the Great Rebellion in India in 1857, which many people will, of course, know about. And that rebellion was very influential in shaping British criticism of empire. But in 1865, we have a major rebellion of former slaves and their descendants, right? So it's only about just not even 30 years after emancipation of slaves in Jamaica. And this rebellion is a rebellion which is really about the right of former slaves not to work as wage laborers on the plantations on which they were once slaves. And it's also a rebellion, I think, much more clear-cut than 1857 was in British India, which is, it's a demand for land. It's a demand to be able to farm small pieces of land. It is a demand to define freedom, not as the British want their colonial subjects to define freedom, but to define freedom in their own way, right? So what they're saying is, we were once freed, we were once slaves, now we are free. Britain wants us to work on the slave plantations as waged labor. We don't want that. What we want is small plots of land on which we can live dignified, self-sustaining, independent lives. So it's also a kind of refusal of the capitalist economy that Britain had put in place in the slave colonies, in the former slave colonies. And this is a rebellion that, like many others, was brutally crushed. There were many deaths. There were the so-called ringleaders were hanged in many cases where they weren't even necessarily involved with the rebellion. But the important thing about this rebellion, as indeed all the others I look at in the book, is that it caused a controversy back in Britain. And it caused a huge controversy back in London, where many of London's famous writers and intellectuals basically were divided on the question of what had happened in Jamaica and who should be punished for it. And I argue that that controversy was in fact fostered by the rebellion of the free slave, and that therefore it is the freed slave whose voice and whose aspirations need to be taken seriously when we think back on what happened in Jamaica. This was also presented as a kind of very British affair, you know, the British conscience feeling terrible about what had happened in Jamaica. And my argument is that that's only part of the story, that every time the British conscience is awakened, it always involves rebellion and crushing that rebellion. And therefore, we need to look at who makes claims on the so-called British conscience. And that is, in fact, the figure of the rebel.
Right. Well, this is really excellent. I had no idea about this. So when you talk about the British conscience here, how, as a researcher, how do you locate that conscience and the development of that conscience?
Look, I mean, there are, the conscience, the national conscience is a kind of a mythology in itself, wherever it emerges, because different people can use it in different ways. I mean, we know, for instance, in India, it's been used in very particular ways in recent years. So I don't, obviously, I'm not saying that there is such a thing as the British conscience. I'm saying that whenever the British conscience is invoked, right, when it is invoked as the reason, for instance, that freedom was given or abolition of slavery happened, I'm saying that this conscience always comes into play only when there is rebellion and the crushing of rebellion, right? So it is a construct, but it is a construct that comes into play whenever there is a rebellion. Now, in the book, there are different kinds of invocations of this conscience. Sometimes it is the conscience of the state, the conscience of parliament, the parliamentary conscience. But sometimes it is the conscience of those who saw themselves as allied with ordinary British people and the ethical values of ordinary British people as opposed to the ethical values of the ruling classes. So the British conscience is a kind of movable signifier, right? It floats. It depends on who is using it. But my interest was really in seeing at what point does the British conscience get invoked and why. And it turns out that it doesn't get invoked, you know, on its own accord. It is always invoked when there is resistance to British rule.
Right. And how does, you know, these big projects like the railway come into this? You mentioned the invocation of the British conscience. Are you know, the construction of the railways and all the great stuff, you know, the universities and the rest that have come into India and other parts of the world from the British Empire, are these ever also used in the same line?
Sorry, can you say that last bit again?
Are these also used in the same line in terms of, you know, in the invocation of conscience?
Yes, I mean, in Britain, it's almost a joke the extent to which the railways, particularly in India, though not only in India, are used as, you know, hard evidence of how benevolent empire was. And in fact, on British television, there are repeatedly programs on railway journeys in the subcontinent, right? And it's a kind of almost a kind of obsession. The railways, as Britain gave them to the rest of the world. Again, whether it's the railways or whether it's law and order or whether it's the English language, what we have to understand is that the fact that we might use them today, right, do not mean that they are an absolute good. We know that the railways were put in place in part to be able to take out resources, take them to the ports, to bring in goods to be sold, and to make the administration of large land masses easier. Okay, so they weren't put, as Walter Rodney says, they weren't put so that Africans or Indians could visit their friends. That was not the primary purpose of railways. The fact that we now use them, and you know, it's a kind of post-colonial legacy that we've picked up and run with, does not mean that they were an absolute good. Similarly with the English language, and this is something I think that is particularly poignant in the context of South Asia, perhaps, particularly in India, in the sense that English language was put in place, as Lord Macaulay very explicitly says, as a means of creating a class of interpreters between the British and the millions whom they governed, right? So again, this was a political bestowal of language. It was intended to create a powerful class. And I, for one, am a descendant of that class. You know, that I always tell my students, yeah, I mean, exactly. Those of us who are Anglophone South Asians are in some senses descendants of that class of interpreters. Our class benefited in some sense, right? We came into the post-colonial age primed to become the middle classes of the newly independent nations. We still have enormous cultural capital that the large mass of people in India, Pakistan, Bangladesh do not have, and that capital enables us to benefit from globalization in a way that the large mass of people cannot benefit. So today, when in India people say, well, you know, the fact that we can speak English is great and this gives us an advantage over China or whatever, you have to say, well, it gives some people an advantage, but that doesn't mean it was an absolute good, right? And that, in fact, a large number of people, and I would say this is perhaps more of a problem in India than Pakistan, I may be wrong, which is there is a class of people who benefit from English, and then there is a very large number of people who have no access to it at all. And my sense from talking to Pakistanis is that most Pakistanis are bilingual in a way that the English-speaking middle classes of India are not necessarily bilingual. But again, I don't know enough to know if this is true, but certainly English confers cultural capital and privilege. So even as a so-called gift, it's a poisoned chalice because it has actually created another set of hierarchies in societies that are already divided by caste and religious hierarchies. So again, there is nothing unambiguous about what empire has left behind and, you know, things that we treat as gifts or advantages.
Certainly. I wanted to ask you a bit more about your method. Your first book, you worked with fiction, pamphlets, even cinema to sort of weave together a narrative. In your subsequent book, and of course now in Insurgent Empire, what is the trajectory that you've taken in terms of your research methods?
Okay. Look, I'm a literary critic. In the most recent book, I've dabbled on the terrain of history. My method, such as it is, such as I would theorize it, is that I'm a close reader. So I work with historical and literary materials. Those may be well known. They may require a degree of archival work, as was the case with the progressive writers. Many of those texts were very well known. So they were people like Saadat Hasan Manto, Ismat Chughtai, Khwaja Ahmed Abbas. These are all well-known texts. But I also went off and I kind of dug into the research, into the film archives in India, for instance. Or I went off and I looked at materials by Chughtai that people hadn't looked at so much, or accounts of Manto's court trials. Which are all there. I mean, it wasn't kind of deep archival work. These are all there, but they've been less well looked at. And I close read them to see what insights one might glean, but keeping history in mind at all times. And I think with this book, the most recent book, I slightly flipped that. It was historical materials, which I read with a literary critic's eye. So I guess in as much as I have a kind of methodology, it's kind of bringing history and the skills of close reading in dialogue with each other.
Right. So, your book is, as much as is apparent, is very much geared towards, a British readership. What can Pakistanis, for example, learn from the book?
Okay. Pakistanis or Indians, let me make my comments kind of pan-subcontinental, okay?
Absolutely.
The book is about resistance. The book is about the importance of dissidents, no matter where we are. The book is about, nominally or substantially, about dissidents in Britain and dissidents against colonialism. But the truth is that we live in India and in Pakistan and in Bangladesh. We live with a very living legacy of empire. We are, I mean, this is perhaps a controversial thing to say. In many ways, these nation states are creatures of empire. They were left behind by empire. Now, I'm not saying that this is all empire's fault. Obviously, these are entities that the peoples of these regions made, but they were left behind by empire. The nation state, as we know it, first of all, the nation state is a very new idea. I mean, you know this, of course, and others know this. It's not much older than the 18th century. Even in Europe, it's not much older than the 18th century. In the subcontinent, we are not even 100 years old as nation states go. So we are very, very young nation states. I end the book talking about how Britain needs to grapple with the question of decolonization. I end the book talking about the fact that Britain has not dealt with the legacies of empire. It hasn't thought, and young British people have not been given the opportunity to think about the ways in which the British Empire has shaped their contemporary present. And I invite young people in Britain and others to grapple with the legacy of empire, to grapple with the extent to which present-day Britain is a creature of empire. But the thing is that exactly what I suggest young Britons should do is exactly what young people, and older people for that matter, in Bangladesh, Pakistan, and India also need to do. And I don't think we have done this. I don't think we have grappled with what it means to be so-called independent nations 70 years after the end of British rule. We have not grappled with the damage that empire has wrought on our habits of mind, on the way in which we relate to each other, on the way in which we think about ourselves, on the way in which, I mean, frankly, the ways in which we have hierarchies of wealth, caste, and class that are not that different from those hierarchies that were there in the days of empire. So I would say that almost all former colonies, and certainly former colonies in South Asia, have substantially failed to decolonize. And at best, we are in a state of arrested decolonization. And the question of what does it really mean to be independent, and here the progressive writers, the Tarakki Pasand, the Pragativad, whatever you might call them on either side of the border, they were prescient, because one of the things that they were saying is that the mainstream vision of nation in India and Pakistan was not their understanding of what freedom meant. For them, freedom didn't just mean, passing power from a set of white guys to a set of brown guys. For them, freedom would only mean something if the societies that would emerge in the wake of independence, in the wake of colonialism, would be radically egalitarian, would be radically redistributive, would be radically different from what had preceded them. And they had that vision. And that vision is, I'm not saying it's the only vision, but that vision of radically egalitarian, radically redistributive nation state has not come true anywhere in any of the nation states of South Asia. And that is, in a sense, the tragedy of a kind of failed decolonization.
Yeah, I was going to say that, when you say radical egalitarianism, I almost sigh when you say that. It may be too much to ask of you, but what explains the persistence of coloniality in contemporary so-called post-colonial world?
I would say, and I'm deliberately going to use colonialism rather than coloniality, and we won't go into that. And the reason I use that is I think colonialism, for me, is a more historical formation. Your question could keep us detained for several hours. It is the $1 million question. It is the question that we have to grapple with. I mean, I can only offer some preliminary thoughts. One of them is that in most cases, independence simply involved the so-called transfer of power. So we took power from the British elites and transferred it to the British or Pakistani elites, right? For the most part, not universally so, but by and large. We didn't really change the hierarchical structures of, caste society, feudal society. Those were largely left in place. The elite continued to be elite. The people who had collaborated with and worked with the British Empire continued to rule. And I think one of the ways in which this is most tragically manifested, and I don't know enough about Pakistan, but I can certainly say this of the Indian context, the penal code left behind by the British is more or less unchanged. It just sits there. And what was used against anti-colonial dissidents is now used against dissidents in India. So now we have poets and intellectuals jailed using a colonial law. We, of course, had the law against homosexuality, which was also a colonial law, right? And to me, that is the kind of most visible symbol of how we didn't even bother to change the legal code that the British had left in place. We didn't bother to change social analysis. We didn't really bother to change how we thought about tribes and castes and religions. We completely accepted at face value the way in which they understood South Asian religions to operate. And we talk about each other in exactly the way that the British talked about us, as groups, as tribes, as castes, as religions. So I guess that is the sort of short answer to your question, is colonialism as a historical structure, even the kind of most basic kind of dismantling, has yet to really be undertaken.
Moving away from, say, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and going back to where you're at, What is the project of decolonization right now as we speak in Britain? Where are you guys standing?
Well, as you will know, Black Lives Matter has made its way to Britain from America, and it's, of course, spread in other parts of the world as well. I think certainly where Britain is concerned, two things have to happen. There is no grappling, as I said earlier, with the consequences of empire. And the fact that people in Britain have very little literacy, historical understanding or literacy around empire means that people have very little understanding of the minority communities in this country. People have very little understanding of why there are Asian communities here, why the Windrush scandal, where Caribbean, British people of Caribbean origin were then deported, so-called back to the Caribbean, why that happened, why Brexit happened. These are all things that are really require an understanding of empire and imperialism to be explained. But I think most saliently, and I think most prominently, the question of race. I think that there has not been a grappling with whiteness, with white supremacy, with the ways in which it operates, because race is a consequence of the imperial project. And there is very little understanding in Britain of how race operates and why it is important to dismantle white supremacy. There's very little understanding even of the fact of white supremacy. So I think discussions around race in particular is where the discussion about empire is at in Britain.
Right. Going more specifically, what is the university sector in Britain doing, say, about the race charter, or race relations, or as a quite well publicized BME attainment gap, for example? Are these even talking points for in universities? Say, for example, yours.
I would say that up until this year, they were talking points in a fairly bureaucratic way. There's a kind of superficial understanding that more diversity is needed. There's a superficial understanding, I think, that racism in British universities needs to be addressed. There was a kind of lackluster effort to obtain a bronze in the Race Equality Charter. I've never understood why you would aim for bronze. Almost nobody in the British university sector aims for gold when it comes to the so-called Race Equality Charter. It's like, it really is the kind of optimism of low expectations. But again, I think I have noticed a shift in recent months with the student protests around statues, around Black Lives Matter, with young people becoming more and more assertive around questions of race. I think I'm seeing a little bit less half-heartedness and a little bit more of a determination to address questions of race and racism. Whether that will last beyond the headlines, whether that will last beyond this year and the pandemic, I don't know. I'm hoping that we are seeing the beginnings of something new, the beginnings of a more genuine and critical discussion on race and on equality.
But then, as far as I can gauge from your conversation, is sort of the work of decolonization the same as diversity work?
No, I mean, clearly it is not. And this is something that many of us have been saying. So the university sector interprets decolonization as diversity. Now, diversity is important. And yes, it is tangentially related to decolonization in that the diversity of British society is very profoundly connected to its empire, to the fact of former imperial peoples, colonized peoples now living in Britain. But it's not in and of itself decolonization. My view is this, that almost nobody, and I would include myself in this grouping, almost nobody understands what decolonization might mean. Now, the slogan itself comes to us from South Africa. It comes to us from Black students in South Africa, beginning at the University of Cape Town, raising questions about their curriculum, raising questions about access to higher education, raising questions about neoliberalism, about fees, about profits. raising a whole number of questions that for them has to do with, in a sense, again, with failed decolonization, the kind of failed promises of the end of apartheid.
Right.
I think that decolonization in Britain is something that is still a question rather than an answer. What will it mean for the university sector in Britain to decolonize? And the answer is not, well, if you teach a little bit more Black or South Asian writing, then you're decolonized. But that is the kind of dominant understanding of decolonization. I think what is asked for is a much more profound engagement, again, with the history and the legacies of empire.
Following up on this very thought, I remember several years ago, moving a bit away from decolonization as something that's yet to be understood to diversity and diversity work, which is sort of much talked about in Britain and the US. I remember Maria Misra sort of talking about diversity work, a couple of years ago. And, I remember her saying that there was this whole call after the civil rights movement of, call towards structural change. And one of the ways that could have been brought about was through affirmative action. But quite swiftly, apparently, it was, put on the sideline in favor of, a much more benign sort of venture, namely diversity work. And when it came to sort of the university sphere, I think diversity work was sort of framed as something that was beneficial for the university because it sort of enriches the student experience, the faculty experience, and everything that's in there. And in addition to someone who plays a cello or who plays a football, or is Black or brown, will certainly create for a very multicultural and enlightening sort of experience for everyone who's involved. But lo and behold, what this usually meant in sort of elite spaces was that you only have a couple of tick box brown faces and maybe even fewer Black faces, and in turn, what that allowed was that a lot of white men and women going to these university spaces would actually get extra credit towards their internationalism, their ability to interact with these sort of token faces on their campuses, and then these same people would go on to be in successful international careers where they can, because of this sort of internationalist of sort of colorful experience of them in the university years, they can work in Hong Kong, Japan, South Africa, India, and make deals across the globe, and add to the wealth of their countries, and so on and so forth. But in all of this, it sort of it felt as if this notion that there's some sort of structural problem, of a whole group of people that was supposed to be catered towards, that is sort of it feels as if that was sort of left behind. And most likely, you only have a few folks who are already well advantaged and well placed who get entry into these elite spaces. And in any case, even before sort of the end of empire and decolonization, there were always a few Black and brown faces who had access to these elite spaces. So first of all, do you agree with this view? And if this is the case, is there a different way to do things?
I haven't heard Maria Misra's comments, so I don't know exactly what she said. I mean, I think it is broadly correct that structural change has been evaded in favor of, the smiling brown and Black face in the largely white photograph. I mean, diversity work is much easier. It's a lot less challenging. Even in America, where there is affirmative action, it has yet to really yield substantial structural change. That said, I, as somebody who studied in America for my graduate work, I was struck when I came to Britain at how, at an equivalent university, there were far fewer Black faces. There are still, I would say elite Asian faces in elite institutions. As you say, that is a long-term thing, that particularly Indians, upper caste Indians, are easily to be found in any British university, where you will not have, certainly at Cambridge, I think we currently have one, maybe two Black staff entirely, right, in all of Cambridge. And I think only one is British black. If
my
that,
God.
I'm not even very sure.
More than getting rid of that bell that Cambridge was talking about, it'd be good to hire more people.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. I mean, you do need, I think, more than symbolic removal of this or that artifact. But that said, I think that we have to grapple with two things. One is the question of the ways in which higher education has itself been made inaccessible to classes beyond the elites, right? So if you make higher education something that you have to pay fees for, something that you already need a certain amount of education and a certain privileged education in order to be able to access, then you're already excluding large swathes of the population, certainly black, in Britain, certainly black and Bangladeshi young people are excluded from higher education and in far greater numbers than white or Indian British students. So what I'm saying is, yes, the question of structural change is important, but that question has to go alongside the question of how higher education is funded and how we ensure that people who want it have access to it regardless of their educational background. We already have educational apartheid in Britain, as indeed we do in both India and Pakistan. There is a division between the government school or the state school sector and the private school sector, so that education in all these contexts is a commodity which only the relatively affluent can access, and therefore the relatively affluent go on to become more and more affluent. So absolutely, the question is structural, and it's a structural question around race in Britain. But it's also a structural question around class and the funding of higher education. I am all for affirmative action. I mean, very often, even my more progressive colleagues will say, yes, we need change, but no, we can't have affirmative action. That'll just, devalue education. And there is still that kind of concept which I think drives people's minds, and it's very familiar to me from India, which is that merit should be the only
meritocracy,
yeah, exactly, it's a meritocracy. And I think that those ideas need to be grappled with as well, because as long as those ideas are operative and as long as we treat education as a commodity rather than a public good, then structural change is not going to happen, because we haven't even begun to look at the question of how education is provided and who has access to it.
Right. So many other questions to ask you, but I'm also getting pinged with
Okay.
hundreds of questions for you. So I think we might just jump into those. Perhaps I may request you to, after, if you have time, maybe you could do a bit of a reading for us as well. Okay, so the first question is, you note that all the things the British now note as the good of empire were done for other reasons. But isn't this true of all governments, colonial or not? Do you really think governments do things only for altruistic reasons?
I don't think governments, do things for altruistic reasons. That said, I think there is a manifest difference between colonialism as an enterprise and the aspirations of democratic post-colonial nation states. And here I would make a distinction between what governments do and what governments are supposed to do. Altruism is neither here nor there. Post-colonial nation states, certainly in the case of India and Pakistan and Bangladesh, came into being in the name of the people, in the name of giving and safeguarding rights, in the name of radical equality, liberty, fraternity, and in the name of redistribution. These are not colonial goals. Colonialism may have said later on, oh yeah, we wanted to civilize the natives, oh yes, we wanted to give the English language and railways, but colonialism did not have a constitution. Colonialism did not set out to be for the benefit of the people it colonized. And this is something that British critics of empire repeatedly say. Don't be hypocritical. We are not in the Caribbean or in India in order to make the lives of those people better. But the post-colonial nation states, whether they actually do it in practice or not, are explicitly set up in the name of safeguarding the rights and the needs of the people. So there is, I would say, for all the failures to decolonize, there is a manifest difference between colonialism as an endeavor and the aspirations, regardless of the reality, the aspirations of post-colonial nation states. And it is to those aspirations that we have to hold our governments and our politicians accountable.
Right. Our next question is, can there be an emancipatory politics that does not address questions of gender and sexuality-based inequities? If the answer is no, what explains the silence of significant corpus of anti-colonial resistance on these questions of gender and sexuality?
Yes, the answer is manifestly no. I mean, gender has to be a significant part of any emancipatory enterprise, gender, sexuality, caste, religion, all of it. What explains the significant silences? I mean, they're not always silences. Women are part of the discussion, but it is certainly true that the great figures of anti-colonialism, like the great figures of much else that precedes us, is patriarchal. It is men. It is men. It is patriarchy. It is male privilege. It is the fact that men get published, heard, written about, get to speak in the public sphere. What I would say is that there is a difference between saying there are these silences which need to be undone and saying that those silences are constitutive, right? So when you have someone like Frantz Fanon or Aimé Césaire, who are kind of the great theorists of anti-colonialism, they touch on gender. They don't particularly talk about it in any detail. I don't see their silences as constitutive. I don't see what they theorize as necessarily reliant on leaving gender out of the equation. Gender can become part of the discussion, and it is women and feminists and sexual dissidents, sexual minorities and dissidents who can force that conversation open. But I don't think anti-colonialism emerges as a fully formed God, perfect. It is like any other formation, it has to be held to account, and its silences and its failures and weaknesses have also got to be addressed. There is nothing fully formed. Anti-colonialism, in my mind, is a process, not a product. And that process involves constantly raising questions, and that would involve questions around gender, feminism, gay rights, queerness, dissidence, and so on.
So our next question is again about colonialism. Is everything good or is everything bad? So the idea is the Britons banned sati in India. Wasn't that a complete good? Can they not get credit for that, for example?
First of all, sati was actually not exactly the widespread process that the British made it out to be. It is certainly true that as part of the wider project of colonial rule and administration, the ban came in. Now, this was part of a fairly complicated process of negotiations with Indian elites. Remember that along with colonialism, both Hindu and Islamic reformers got into the fray, and they started the process of kind of making reform from within societies. So what I would say is that, yes, of course, naturally the banning of something like sati or the banning of child marriage is an unambiguous good. But what I would question is the presentation of colonialism as necessary in order for that to happen. So that is like saying widespread famines, exploitation, resource immiseration, and destruction of industry is necessary in order for sati to be banned. It is part of the kind of churning. Colonialism was a churning that resulted, among other things, in caste equations being thrown into question, right? Which is why there are those who speak on behalf of caste minorities who say, well, colonialism actually was quite a good thing in the sense that it undid the rule to some extent, and only to some extent, of the Brahmins and the Savarnas and the upper castes and the Ashraf, right? To some extent. But I don't think that colonialism was necessary in order for something like sati to be banned, and the ways in which sati got used as an example of British rule being necessary in order for backward practices to be removed, and that would include child marriage across religious communities in South Asia. Do I think that the banning of child marriage, do I think that the age of consent legislation is good? Manifestly so. But it is quite a different thing to say you needed colonialism in order for that to happen. There are reformist traditions in the subcontinent and in other parts of the world which preceded the British presence, and we don't know where things would have gone had those reformist movements gone somewhere. I simply don't see the one as necessary to the other.
Right. I'm reminded of, from your comments in caste, I'm reminded of Ramnarayan Rawat's work. He mentions that while working in sort of North India, a lot of Dalit groups were quite happy and had a very glowing sort of image of the British Empire, stating that this was part of this was the only thing that in fact brought some goods, sort of some good into what otherwise was a very marginalized community. On a different angle also, Vinayak Chaturvedi, I'm reminded, his work looked at, these very strong anti-colonial actors, working with Gandhi in Gujarat, hailed as, these big anti-colonial agents, basically. People like David Hardiman, has written about this. But then, at the same time, while they were anti-colonial, they were in fact the oppressors of peasant groups within the region that they were placed in. And when this person wrote this particular book, the story of this particular peasant group was completely different, which was reacting not only against colonialism, but also nationalism.
Yeah.
So are there other visions available to us as well then?
Oh, certainly. I mean, the picture of anti-colonialism is a very varied one. In the book, I don't really talk about Gandhi, for instance, partly because Gandhi has been written about very extensively, partly because we know that that particular form of, I wouldn't call it anti-colonialism so much as kind of maybe a resistance, a particular form of resistance to empire, then also had its own kind of authoritarian caste and class strains. Anti-colonialism is a varied picture. There isn't only one form of it. And yes, we must remember, not least in 1857, there were very different kinds of groups involved in the uprising, groups that were not necessarily in harmony with each other. And there were also indigenous Adivasi tribal, as we call them now, uprisings against the Birsa Munda uprising against colonialism, for instance, which was also in the case of India, resistance to landlordism, was resistance to upper castes. And the picture of anti-colonialism is at its best a resistance to oppression, no matter where it manifests. And again, the kind of great theorists of anti-colonialism, and I go back to someone like Frantz Fanon, are never saying, oh, this is just about getting rid of the outsider and then everything will be fine. His point always is that once the white ruler is sent back to where he came from, then begins the task of radical transformation in the post-colonial polity. So anti-colonialism is never simply about getting rid of the foreigner. I mean, that is the vision we now have from certain post-colonial politicians and their very simple-minded nationalism that they peddle. But anti-colonialism is varied and is a heterogeneous picture. It is not about one set of people against another set of people. And it absolutely involves the challenging of other hierarchies as well. The one thing I do want to say about the question of what the British did for the oppressed castes of the subcontinent. I mean, yes, the uprising, the churning, the general, what can I say, the general chaos, if you like, of colonialism and resistance to it, certainly undermined upper caste hierarchies. But let us also remember that the British largely collaborated with the nobility and the upper castes, right? And that is why these are the people who still have power in the subcontinent. It's not as if the British came along and said, oh, now we're going to make it so that the oppressed castes of the subcontinent can rise. They might occasionally have used that as an excuse, but in fact, they continued to empower those who were already empowered. And so therefore, the argument that colonialism was necessary for caste assertion or gender emancipation, I think, again, the picture is a little less simple than it might seem.
Right. So is the suppression of British documents of the Mau Mau rebellion by the UK government an indication of Britain's uneasy relationship with its colonial past?
Yeah, manifestly so. I mean, in a way, the most interesting questions around anti-colonialism and around Britain's relationship to its empire are not around the British Raj. The British Raj was a very particular kind of creature, and it has left behind a very particular set of creatures on the subcontinent. There has, for one thing, British rule in Africa was far more violent in some ways than it was in India, where that caste of interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern allowed for certain elaborate maneuvers. In Africa, the face of British colonialism in the 20th century after independence on the subcontinent was very bloody and very violent. And I think that there is a clear understanding that if the full truth, the full picture of what Britain did in East Africa in particular was to come out, all the claims about the benevolence of empire and the railways and the English language. And again, in the case of Kenya, there was an equivalent argument to sati, right? We banned female genital mutilation. And again, it's not that one says, oh, that's a bad thing. Certainly female genital mutilation is a practice that needed to be eradicated. But again, the British didn't go into Kenya in order to eradicate it. They found something onto which they could latch an excuse, right? The emancipation of women. The emancipation of women was never the goal of empire. It might at best have been, in one or two ways, a side effect. Ultimately, it is feminist movements in India, it is feminist movements in Pakistan, feminist movements in Kenya that result in the emancipation of women. Women, like any other category, cannot be emancipated by others. Emancipation is something that you have to do for yourself. You have to claim your rights. So again, to come back to the original question, the face of British Empire in Kenya was vicious right into the 1960s. And if the truth of that was to come out, really Britain's self-image in the world would be completely destroyed, which is why so much time, energy, and money has been spent in destroying those archives, because the world will really actually never know the full truth of what happened there.
Well, I certainly hope there are a lot more graduate students who are keenly listening to you right now. In that sort of line also, there's an advice question. So should one be, I suppose this is towards, decolonization work. Should one be a warrior on their own or formulate a collective resistance? What is more effective? As individuals, one can be purist but not effective. On the other hand, collective action can be effective, but it requires so many compromises. So what is, are you a purist but ineffective, or effective but compromised?
I would say, and perhaps this is a cop-out, I think we need both. Okay. I don't think that one can have collective action without reflection and self-criticism. And I don't think one can have lone individuals with no collective to answer to. I mean, I will say for myself, and only for myself, that I have found the example of Edward Said helpful to how I think about myself in the academy. And not everybody, not all intellectuals are in the academy, only some are, and not all people in the academy are intellectuals. But in thinking about how I position myself in relation, on the one hand, to intellectual work, and on the other hand, to collective movements for social justice, it has been helpful for me to think about Edward Said's reflections on this, which really were, again, to say we are answerable to movements for emancipation, for liberation, for social justice, for the eradication of bigotry and inequality. These are collective. They have to be collective. They can't be individual achievements. But at the same time, one can have a sense of oneself, not as a purist, but as somebody who will speak the truth, not just about power, but to movements. To be, that one would have the courage to say to a movement that one is part of, I don't think this is right. I don't think this is the way we should be doing things. I think we should reflect on this. So I would say intellectuals need movements and movements need intellectuals. And I don't think actually we can function in a sense without the kind of vital relationship of the two. So, solidarity is important, but so is criticism. People always say to me, the intellectual speaks truth to power. I don't certainly conceive of myself as speaking truth to power. Power doesn't care. You can speak to power all you want. Power doesn't care about you. Power ignores you. What you can do is to speak the truth about power to a movement, to learn from a movement, but to also speak to the movement about, where it is going and where it might want to go and what it should be thinking about. I think movements and intellectuals have to be in a constant state of dialogue.
I think this next question is more towards where you're situated. It says, whether given your comment about Sunak and Patel, I think this is probably a tweet or something, whether given your comment on Sunak and Patel, you think it's a good idea to inject caste into Western political debate, and how would you reflect on the relationship of your own caste background and privilege to your own elite academic platform?
Oh, yeah. I mean, do I think it's a good idea? Yes, I think it's a good idea. I think nothing should be evaded because one doesn't like how it looks. In fact, I think that caste is a particularly important thing to talk about in its own right. It's, Indians in particular, I don't know whether Pakistanis do this, but Indians don't like washing their dirty linen in front of Firang eyes, right? And, to some extent you can say, okay, yes, the Firang gaze is judgmental and you don't want to do it. But on the other hand, I actually see no virtues in dishonesty wherever we are. But equally, and to answer the second part of the question, learning about race and being a racial minority in a largely white society has actually made me think about caste much more than I had to when I was in India. In India, I was part of the upper castes. I was a white person for all practical purposes. I didn't have to think about caste. I was, I benefited from it. End of story. Why would I think about it? It was to my advantage not to think about it. But now looking at the functions of white supremacy, I have been able to understand exactly how Brahmin supremacy functions, because I hear the same things coming out of white mouths that I hear from patriarchs in my family, right? The same self-serving justifications, the same refusal to look at reality in the eye, the same self-pity, the same nonsensical excuses that white men may make, elite white men may make, elite Brahmin men also make. So for me, actually putting the two in dialogue has been absolutely fundamental to understanding my own caste position.
That's really fascinating.
Yeah. Just to finish the question, I have no doubt that if I was not an Indian upper caste, and if I was not a descendant of the class of interpreters between us and the millions whom we govern, I manifestly wouldn't be here. Overwhelmingly, the Indian presence in British and US academia is upper caste. I don't know whether the equivalent is true for Pakistan. I would imagine that feudals and ashrafs constitute a very significant part of the Muslim Pakistani and Bangladeshi presence. The latter is, of course, quite small in Western academia. So certainly, I've always said decolonization is a two-way lens. The minute you criticize white supremacy and imperialism, you must turn that critical lens back upon yourself. And otherwise, it's a self-serving process. Sorry, Abraham, you were about to say.
No, I was actually reminded of Anupama Rao. She made a very similar comment about this, because she's written the book on caste, and she said, growing up in Chicago and the great inequality that she experienced there is what moved her to writing about caste and exploring that. So I did connect with that. The next question is, what do you think about the so-called creamy layer within the concept of the so-called creamy layer within a group coming to monopolize and hoard the benefits of positive discrimination or affirmative action? Do you agree with the Indian Supreme Court's ruling that reservations should not be given to OBC children of senior government officials, judges, and army officers? Can we or should we seek to disaggregate the privileged from the disadvantaged within minority groups?
I am going to say this. I mean, I think that the creamy layer argument is one that has been also used in self-serving ways, right? And I certainly know from my own experience as a kind of very young person, I remember as a young person saying things like, I'm much more bothered about class than caste, right? And in a way, it's a very self-serving, convenient argument for somebody who is upper caste to say, but real transformation has to do with class and not caste. Again, watching how race operates and race in relation to Black people in Western societies, you understand that it's not so simple as, once there's a Black middle class, they can be excluded from affirmative action, because race and caste also have their own specific operations that are not reducible to class. Okay, so I think it is very premature at best to be having the creamy layer discussion, because caste is not something that disappears just because you have a government job or just because you become a lawyer or a banker. Okay, caste continues to exercise its insidious forms of marginalization. So at this moment in history, I am not in agreement that we should set aside a creamy layer and then look at the so-called real marginalized. Certainly all forms of reparation have to be intersectional. We have to look at poverty, we have to look at gender, we have to look at other forms of marginalization. But that doesn't just mean that just because one generation of Dalits become middle class, the problem has somehow gone away. The structures, the very lethal structures of caste supremacy in India are a very long way from being undone. And so I think that this is a kind of a red herring at this point in time.
Right. I'll ask only two last questions and then we'll have to wrap this up, even though this is such an exciting and engaging discussion. The question is whether in the UK, do you think whether in the UK class and regional disadvantage should come into consideration when we're talking about affirmative action? Would you agree that an objective approach to data should lead us to target those groups that are most disadvantaged in education and social mobility, such as British Pakistani children, Afro-Caribbean, and working class white boys, over affluent, above average performing groups such as British Hindus and East African diaspora, South Asians in particular? In short, should we follow the implications of the data and target those least likely to attend university or enter parliament?
I mean, look, any affirmative action is reparative, right? So it's a reparative action. So reparative action, to some extent, must be led by the data, and it's manifestly the case that, and I have always been very clear about saying this, that affirmative action, for instance, at Cambridge would not apply to in the same way to British Hindus and British Indians as a class. This doesn't mean that they don't suffer from racism or they don't suffer from certain forms of the ways in which white supremacy functions. Manifestly, the groups that are very clearly excluded from higher education are British Bangladeshis and Afro-Caribbeans. The white working class boys thing is, I think, again, a slightly separate discussion that I would want to have separately, because it is used by Tory politicians to suggest that race is not the issue, but really class is the issue. It's a version of the poor Brahmin,
pitting
which
one
is
against
used,
the other.
yeah, pitting one against the other. But yes, northern working class children, regardless of race, working class children, regardless of race, Afro-Caribbean children, British Bangladeshis, British Pakistanis, groups that are historically and disproportionately excluded from higher education must be the target of reparative action. That seems to me quite obvious.
Right. Now, the final question is, Dissent was vocal and lasting with anti-colonialism. Will it play an important role against Modi, or has India changed?
Will it play an important role? It is the only thing that can play an important role, because what we see now in India is a great deal of acquiescence and a great deal, if not active acquiescence, of passive acceptance of the situation. It is nonetheless worth recalling that there are dissidents all across the political map, including Dalits, including Dalit Bahujan leaders, young leaders, as well as the older ones, including Indian Muslims and Indian Muslim women who have been very vocal in the protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act, including those intellectuals and writers who are in jail right now. Baba Saheb Ambedkar's relative, Professor Anand Teltumbre, Varavara Rao, who is in his mid-80s, the poet, who is also shamefully in jail, Sudha Bharadwaj, the writer and campaigner, who is in jail, and of course, the number of kind of activists for Kashmiri rights. So the map of dissidents is utterly vital precisely at the moment that it looks like dissidence is futile and acquiescence is all there is. So absolutely, the idea of dissidence and the ways in which dissidence was, for better or for worse, protected by the Indian Constitution, that has to be brought back into the fray. And it is not just the greatest hope we have, it is the only hope we have.
Right, right. Well, on that really encouraging note, I'd like to thank you for such an excellent conversation that I've been able to have, and for so many viewers of ours. And I encourage everyone to buy this book. I was able to get it on Kindle. It's currently not available in Pakistan, but I'm hoping that there's some publisher watching us right now who will email you soon to say that, let's cut a deal for a Pakistan edition, and then, we can all have a cheaper version easily available in Pakistan. And so with my praise to a cheaper Pakistani edition and a great new term for you as Chair Professor, thank you very much. And to all our viewers, please remember, wear your masks and wash your hands for 20 seconds. Thank you very much.
Can I just intervene? Would you mind hanging on to the comments or saving them so that I can see them? Because I haven't been able to follow the discussion as closely as you have. And thank you to you and to everyone for listening. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.